Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we are deeply involved in a study of the challenge of Christ. As a reminder, perhaps you're joining us for the very first time. For the last 2 years, I've been sharing and I've been discussing and investigating the subject of the challenge of Christ. What is that? Well, in John chapter 10 verse 37, by the way, a passage humongously ignored in evangelical Christianity. Unless, of course, they're talking about the resurrection. Now, if they're talking about resurrection, most believers will say, well, Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, then do not believe me. And Jesus said he was going to be raised from the dead. If he's not raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain. So see, that's the challenge of Christ. We can meet that. But most evangelicals will then turn around and when confronted by a Jew, a Muslim, an atheist or agnostic who will point out Jesus not only said he was going to be raised from the dead, that he was going to raise himself from the dead, John 10:18, but he also said he was coming back in the glory of the Father with his angels in judgment of every man before that first generation passed away. He didn't do that. All you got to do is look around, and earth is still here, time is still here, time still marches on. Therefore, Mr. Christian, Mrs. Christian, your Jesus failed or he lied. Either way, he's not the Son of God, because after all, you just told me, Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. And one of the works was his resurrection. Therefore, if he wasn't resurrected, he's not the Son of God. Okay, that's true. That's valid. So for argument's sake, says the atheist or skeptic, I'll grant you that. But he also said he was coming back in judgment in that generation. He didn't do it. Earth is still here. Time marches on. Your Jesus failed his own challenge. How are you going to answer that? And if you think for one moment that the enemies of Christ are not going to use that argument, you are being horribly naive, because they use it all the time. Okay, so here's what we have. We have this multitudinous statements in the New Testament that Christ was coming back. His coming, the end of the age, the judgment, the resurrection were at hand. Coming soon, quickly, shortly, in the New Testament period of time, that is, in the first century. How then do we explain this conundrum, this paradox, this problem? We do so by acknowledging and by understanding, maybe even by learning for the very first time, that Jesus was using typical hyperbolic apocalyptic language that is used throughout the entirety of the Old Testament, sometimes called the Tanakh, commonly called that, in which God would use one nation to judge another nation. God, in his sovereignty, used, for instance, the Assyrians to destroy the 10 northern tribes of Israel and to carry them off into Assyrian captivity. In Isaiah chapter 10, 5 and following, the Lord said that Assyria was his rod of anger. Assyria was the staff in his hand. Now, did Assyria think so? No. Assyria thought it was her gods, empowering her to conquer the nations. But he said, no, I'm in charge, said Yahweh. I'm using them to destroy Israel. All she thinks about is to kill people, to tread them down into the mud, to destroy the nations. It's in my heart, it's in my mind, Yahweh said, to use them to punish my disobedient people. Now, in that destruction of Israel in 721 BC at the hands of the Assyrians, guess what? Micah 1 says God came out of heaven and he trod on top of the mountains and the earth melted underneath his feet. Well, I'm pretty sure that didn't happen literally, right? Okay, so this is an extremely brief reminder of the nature of apocalyptic language. I discussed this language in my book, Who is This Babylon, that I'm going to refer to later on in today's video. Okay, but this is an extremely important book to help you understand the nature of biblical language. Another book that I've written, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, goes into even greater detail, documenting passage after passage after passage that spoke of the coming destruction of heaven and earth. Oh, but wait, it was talking about the destruction of Israel, the destruction of Assyria, the destruction of Babylon, the destruction of Edom, and on and on and on. And again, pretty clearly, literal physical heaven and earth was never destroyed at the time of the destruction of any of those nations. It's metaphoric language, ladies and gentlemen. And Jesus in Matthew 16, 27 and 28 said that his coming, his parousia, in judgment of all men, with the angels, was going to be in the glory of the Father, which means it was going to be in the same way that the Father had come. So, ladies and gentlemen, if the Father had never ever come literally, visibly, bodily out of heaven to destroy literal physical heaven and earth, and when Jesus said that's the way he was coming, same way the Father had come, that means Jesus was not promising that he was going to come as a literal physical 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body and destroy literal physical heaven and earth. Okay, enough of that rehash, enough of that rehearsal. All of these New Testament statements tell us that that time was at hand, quickly, coming quickly, shortly, and soon. They tell us that the appointed time of the end had drawn near. So what we have been doing is showing that the Old Testament prophets set the time for the eschatological consummation. Now, I posed a question last week. I hope that you have been pondering this. When the skeptics say, well, Jesus got it wrong. New Testament writers got it wrong when they said the appointed time had come, when Jesus said what the prophets longed to look into and were never able to realize, to see, come to fruition. His apostles were seeing that take place. Matthew 13, 17. But if the Old Testament prophets, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 12, Daniel 9, if the Old Testament prophets got the time right, the appointed time right, then how is it that Jesus actually failed? How can the Old Testament prophets be right and the New Testament prophets, who base their entire eschatology on the Old Testament, how could they have gotten it so wrong? Okay. So once again, we're in Daniel chapter 9, and we're looking at this time period, the appointed time of the end. 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon your holy city. And 6 constituent elements are given that were to be fulfilled within that period of 70 weeks. Among them, to make the atonement, to put away sin, and we've been focused lately on this subject of to finish the transgression. As I have shared with you, many Hebrew scholars, Hebrew linguists, as well as scholars of all stripes, agree that what this means is that Daniel is being told 70 weeks are determined to fit for Israel. Now remember, 70 weeks are determined upon your people and city. This is not, as I said repeatedly last week, this is not about America filling up the measure of her sin. It is not about Russia or China. This is about Israel filling up the measure of her sin within the confines of and by the end of the 70 weeks. Anytime, ladies and gentlemen, anytime and anyone that tries to apply Daniel chapter 9 to any other time period than Israel's history, or that tries to apply the constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9 to any other period different from Israel's covenant history is misusing and abusing and perverting Daniel 9. Now, I know that's strong language, okay? And I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone. Hope you understand that. I'm not attacking individuals. I'm not attacking anyone's sincerity or questioning it in any way whatsoever. I'm simply pointing out that when you take a text outside of the confines that it establishes for itself as to the focus of the people under consideration and in regard to the timing of that consideration of that prophecy, then that is an abuse of that prophecy. Now we know that the 70-week countdown brings us to the very time of Jesus' baptism. 463 years brings us to the very time of Jesus' baptism. I'm not going to go into, all that mathematical calculation. Look, here's what we can know, ladies and gentlemen. I had somebody just this last week tell me, Preston, your entire calculation is completely off because the 70th week is not completed. And Daniel 9, 26 and 27 has not one thing to do with the fall of Jerusalem. And I was stunned when I read that. Now look, folks, we have the beginning of the countdown. It's widely admitted. That's the beginning of the decree by Artaxerxes for the Jews to be able to go back to Jerusalem and there to rebuild the city and the temple. Okay. You come to the time of Jesus, 463 years. And yes, I'm aware of Cyrus, and I don't have a problem even with that. Okay? But again, I'm not getting into this. The point of it is, when you take that calculation, it brings you directly to the period of Jesus' generation. So we have the beginning of the calculation. We have the 62 weeks to rebuild and to restore Jerusalem. And after the 69th week, in the middle of the week, Messiah will be cut off. Well, if you've got after the 69th week, but you're in the middle of the week, what week does that make it? The 70th week. So we have 62 weeks, 7 weeks, and then the 70th week and the middle of that 70th week. So we have a chronological countdown, 62, 7, and then it says, and the end thereof, the end of what? The countdown. The end thereof shall come with an overwhelming flood, according to some translations. The city and the sanctuary will be destroyed. And the abominations shall be set up. And again, the end will come with total devastation. Some translations and some commentators point out that the imagery here, it shall come like a flood. But what's he talking about? The destruction of the city and the temple. Now, if the full end is the full end of the 70 weeks, and if the end thereof, the 70th week, which is after the death of Messiah, which is in the middle of the week, then the full end is the end of the 70th week. And what's happening? The destruction of the city and the temple. Well, ladies and gentlemen, guess what? The destruction of the city and the temple didn't take place in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Hello? The end of the city and the temple took place in 70 AD. You cannot get the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9 beyond AD 70. That's the full end. That's the end thereof, of that mathematical calculation of the 70 weeks, 69 weeks, or 62 weeks, 7 weeks, half of the week after the 69th week has to be in the 70th week, and the full end has to be the full end of the 70th week, when the city and the temple would be destroyed. Now, what that means is this. When Daniel was told 70 weeks are determined to finish the transgression, that meant that Israel's sin had to be filled up prior to AD 70, so that the destruction of the city and the temple could be the judgment on Israel for filling up the measure of her sin. Now, very briefly, I've got to point this out. I've been corresponding lately with some people who say, well, the 70th week ended at the cross. Well, no. Jesus said that Israel would not fill up the measure of their sin until, number one, they killed him, Matthew chapter 21, which we'll look at here in a bit. Jesus said Israel would not fill up the measure of their sin until they killed his apostles and prophets that he would send to Israel. Well, look, Jesus didn't send out his apostles and prophets to speak to Israel until after, or inclusive of, Pentecost and onward. Thus, the 70 weeks were not ended at the cross. Look, folks, the apostles and prophets of Jesus were not killed before the cross. They were only killed after Jesus sent them to go into all nations and to preach. Some then tell us this is a relatively common view. This is the common view, unless he's changed recently, of Kenneth Gentry. Kenneth Gentry said the 70 weeks ended with the martyrdom of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Well, no, that's not correct, because Stephen was not an apostle. Was he a prophet? Well, yes, we could probably say that. But that still doesn't match what Jesus said, that Israel would fill up the measure of their sin by killing his apostles and prophets. Not just prophets, and not by just killing one prophet that he sent. Prophets, plural. It is therefore untenable and wrong to say that the 70 weeks were fulfilled in 34-35 AD. And as we shall see later, and we'll nail that down firmly, you just can't make 34-35 AD the fulfillment of the 70 weeks. Now, by the way, let me make note of this. Just recently, actually it was last year, but nonetheless, just recently, I completed a very lengthy, in-depth study entitled, When Did or Will the 70 Weeks of Daniel chapter 9 Come to an End? In this study, okay, it's available on DVD, it's available on MP3, it is even available for download on my website. Just go to donkpreston.com and click on store and just do a search for the end of Daniel 9, okay? Now look, folks, I don't know of another study that is as in-depth on Daniel 9 as you're going to find in this study. I have an in-depth study of when were Israel's sins fulfilled. Now, I've got to hurry. We're already into this. But folks, this is so critical to understand these underlying concepts about what Daniel is predicting and when it would come to pass. So when people tell us, well, Israel filled up the measure of their sin by crucifying Jesus, well, that was involved in it, but that was not the totality of it. And they tell us, well, it was at the stoning of Stephen. That was involved in it. It's not the totality of it. I shared with you last week that the book of Revelation depicts the filling up of the measure of sin. It depicts the filling up of the measure of sin of the city that killed the prophets. Please go back, watch that video. Revelation chapter 16, verse 6 is emphatic that Babylon had killed the prophets. Now, who did Jesus say was guilty of killing the prophets historically? It wasn't Rome. Rome never killed an Old Testament prophet. It most assuredly wasn't the Roman Catholic Church. There were no Old Testament prophets alive when the Roman Catholic Church came into being. And it most assuredly was not America or Russia or China or whoever. This helps us identify who Revelation is about. It's about the impending destruction of Jerusalem, the city that killed the prophets. Let's nail that down in the few minutes that we have left for this video. In Revelation chapter 11, now I touched on this ever so briefly last week. Revelation chapter 11, we have the two witnesses. We're not told specifically who they were. There are a wide variety of suggestions. Some say it's John the Baptizer and Jesus. I don't have a problem with that. Some say it's even Jesus and Paul. I have a little bit of a problem with that, but nonetheless, here's the point. The two witnesses, their body, when they were slain by the beast that would rise out of the abyss, their bodies would lie in the street of the city. Folks, you've got to catch the power of this. Their dead bodies would lie in the street of the city, quote, where the Lord was crucified. It is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. Now, I've had people tell me, well, Preston, Jesus wasn't killed in Jerusalem. You see, that's changing the meaning of changing the words of Revelation chapter 11. Revelation does not say the city in which Jesus was slain. No, it says it is where the Lord was slain. And they say, well, again, he wasn't slain within the walls. No, Hebrews chapter 13 and 14 is emphatic. He was slain without the gates. Well, why was Jesus slain without the gates? Some people say he was slain on Golgotha. Well, okay, that's fine, but Golgotha may well have been on the Mount of Olives. You see, Jesus was the offering of the red heifer for the cleansing of sin. Where was the red heifer sacrificed? The red heifer was not sacrificed within the gates of Jerusalem. The red heifer was always slain outside the gates. But let me ask you a question to consider. If you're going to say that, well, Revelation chapter 11, verse 8 cannot be talking about Jerusalem because Jesus wasn't crucified in the city, well, guess what? That must mean that Babylon can't be Rome, because Jesus wasn't slain in Rome. I think you'd agree with that, right? Jesus wasn't slain in the Vatican, right? I think you'd agree with that. I think you'd also agree that Jesus wasn't slain in America or in China or in Russia, Gog and Magog. None of those. But Jesus was most assuredly crucified at Jerusalem. Where's the other city, even close to Jerusalem, where Jesus was slain? You see, I call this argument, when people say, Jesus wasn't crucified within the walls, I call that a classic example of argumentum ad desperatum. These people are so desperate to have a futurist view, to find some identity for Babylon that is not Old Covenant Jerusalem. They're willing to make any kind of an argument. Well, he wasn't crucified within the city. Well, you know what? Jerusalem was responsible. The leaders of Jerusalem were responsible. And he was crucified outside the gate to fulfill antitypologically the typology of the red heifer sacrifice. Hebrews chapter 9, 10 and following. If the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a red heifer sanctifies to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Jesus Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot or blemish unto God, cleanse your conscience to serve the living God? What's the author of Hebrews doing? He's setting forth Jesus as the typological, antitypological fulfillment of the red heifer sacrifice. He is contrasting, okay, the red heifer sacrifice purified the flesh. Jesus' sacrifice purifies the conscience, the heart, the mind, the soul, if you please. It was therefore necessary for Jesus to die outside the gates. But listen, there's some fantastic scholarly work showing that the Mount of Olives was the literal place where the Lord was slain. But you see, the Mount of Olives is so inseparably bound with Jerusalem. Notice also, oh boy, I'm out of time. Okay, I'm gonna have to hold this off until next week. I'll just introduce this. This city, Babylon, this city called the Great City. By the way, the city Jerusalem is called the Great City in other places in Revelation. But the city of Jerusalem is also spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. Ask yourself the question, what city in all of the world was ever spiritually designated as Sodom other than the city of Jerusalem? Get out your Bibles, look it up, read Deuteronomy 32:30 and following, and you'll see. I'll see you next week.